Speaking of coming together, back in the middle 1980s, every Friday night, a ragtag group would come together to play basketball in Silver Spring, Maryland. One of those people was our next speaker, Wayne Parcelle, and we had our differences on the basketball court. Wayne could use his left hand and I couldn't. We've had differences in the years since. As U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director, I signed the proposal to take Great Lakes wolves off the endangered species list, and as HSUS CEO, Wayne took me to court, won. Kind of pissed me off, Wayne. But we haven't let differences, a few differences, get in the way of working together on our common passion, animal protection. And by working together, we achieved a lot to help save animals from extinction, like banning domestic ivory sale here in the United States. Diversity makes us stronger, not weaker. Diversity in race and gender and ethnicity and religion and diversity in perspective. Our next speaker brings perhaps a different perspective, but he shares a common and core value and passion for animal protection. Since becoming Chief Executive Officer and President in 2004, Wayne Parcelle has grown the Humane Society of the United States through mergers, volunteer engagement, and a remarkable range of corporate and policy gains into a global force for animal protection. HSUS has helped pass more than 1,100 state animal protection laws and more than 100 federal statutes during his tenure. Please join me in welcoming our next speaker, Wayne Parcelle.
Dan, you definitely want to be ready if you play basketball, Dan. He leads with his elbows. He really does. I knew when he was nominated for Director of Fish and Wildlife Service that he had the toughness to withstand the political process in Washington, D.C. And I want to tell you that I have been at this my entire adult life working on animal welfare issues, and I've always had a great interest in public policy issues, and I've closely followed administration after administration. And I will tell you, without hesitation, Dan Ash was the best U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Director that the nation has had. You've done a great job, Dan. Thank you very, very much for it. And Dennis, and to the board of AZA, thank you for having me. As Dan said, you know, I know that this whole idea of having me here for some of you may be a provocative sort of notion. And I really do believe that in so many ways it's a statement of confidence, not about me, it's a statement of confidence about AZA, that the values and tenets you hold are enduring and valuable and defensible. And this exchange of ideas that must happen in every enterprise, in every profession, in every community, and in our society is critical to our forward progress. And I come here not as an adversary, I come here entirely in 100% thought as an ally of AZA. I hold up AZA as the model and the standard in the zoo and aquarium industry. Before getting into some of those issues, I want to tell you a little bit about the Humane Society of the United States and our affiliates, because I think it's important to talk about our tactics and approaches and our end goals and what we do. There are a lot of folks who try to characterize AZA in a certain way. There are a lot of folks who characterize the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or animal protection groups or HSUS, and I want to tell you directly a little bit about what we do. So I think you can see from this first slide, if you will, do I hit that? Yes, okay, great. We're about all animals. You can see our logo embedded in the middle of that screen, that we're 19 different animals in the shape of the United States, which is meant to convey that we're about protecting all animals, domesticated animals and wild animals, and doing it on a big scale. And all of the animals pictured there, we have programs to advocate for. Many people, when you think of the nomenclature of humane society, you think of rescue and you think of direct care. And that's a big part of our work at the organization. We have people now still, and we will have people for months in Texas helping to respond to the animal crisis situations. Not just the domesticated animals, the animals who were rescued from flooded homes, but also wildlife. Also cattle. We did an aerial survey and saw thousands of stranded cattle, and we worked with the National Guard and others to deliver hay to those animals. So our disaster response team will be on the ground in Florida, and that is an important part of what we do to respond to this terrible set of weather events that we've had in the nation. But the rescue work is broader than that. It's about dog fighting. It's about puppy mills. It's about animal hoarding cases, cases where, in some ways, animal protection groups, people who put the brand that we are a sanctuary, lose control of the situation and have an animal hoarding situation that we then have to intervene and rescue animals. But I've said 1,000 times to my colleagues in this field that we cannot rescue our way out of the crisis situation for animals. There are billions of animals in the world, and many of them are in crisis situations. There is not enough money, there's not enough human capital, we don't have enough space and sanctuary for all of them. And we must prevent cruelty, and we must prevent species loss, and we must promote animal welfare and promote conservation values. And that's why we work in the broad range of issues. Of course, we do wildlife care. We rescue prairie dogs. We have the largest wildlife rehabilitation center in terms of intake in the country in Fort Lauderdale, where we evacuated 450 animals from that center this last week. We've dug out in Florida 6,000 gopher tortoises who are going to be entombed by development and relocated them to Air Force bases and other public land areas. But in the broadest sense, rescue and direct care, even though we do a lot of it, we touched 300,000 animals last year with our direct care programs in the United States and abroad, must inevitably be just a portion of our work, because if we devoted all the resources to that issue, we would not be able to scale our programs in a way to affect millions and billions of animals, which is our intention. So we work on public awareness and education, public policy and enforcement to shape the laws, because laws are designed to maintain order in society, but they're also a reflection of our values. There are rules of the road that are set up to stop people from doing terrible things to animals, because animals are vulnerable to us because of the asymmetry and power that exists between humans and animals. And we also, in a capitalist economy, work with the biggest corporations and smaller corporations, because animals are used in many different sectors of our economy. And we want to infuse every sector of the economy with the notion of animal welfare, believing that the idea that businesses can do good and that businesses have values in the daily operations of their work is indispensable to the functioning of our civil society. Business is not just about profit. Business is also about adhering to the things that we care about in our society. And I wrote a book last year called The Humane Economy. And the thesis is that companies are going to do better in a society where people are attuned to the needs of animals when they have animal welfare sensibilities built into that business model. And I'll talk about that today a little bit more. But I also want to underscore that we're a global organization, just like AZA and AZA are global organizations, because the boundaries of our nation are insufficient in terms of a field of play for us when we want to address large-scale animal welfare and conservation issues. So now we have operations in 50 countries and a plan over the next 5 years to expand into 25 more, to have a footprint with offices in 75 countries in the world. And I want to tell you that, there's no unanimity of thought within the animal protection movement. There are some core precepts, there are values, but there is a heterodoxy in the domain of animal welfare. We estimate, by the latest estimates, there are 35,000 animal welfare groups in the United States alone. 35,000. I mean, it's just extraordinary. The HSUS and the ASPCA, each with about a $200 million budget, are the largest, but you have an incredible array of wildlife rehabilitation organizations, animal shelters, species-specific groups, whether they're bear protection groups or chimp groups. This is a remarkable diversity of organizations, and it reflects in so many ways this human bond with animals. If you accept the idea that humans have been around for a couple 100,000 to 2 million years, we lived in pre-agricultural societies for 99% of human history. We were hunters and gatherers. And if you review the anthropological literature, and if you look at how surviving tribal societies operate, you know that they have an encyclopedic knowledge of the fauna and flora. The people in tribal societies are deeply connected to animals. Many of them have rituals of apology to animals whom they kill. They have a pantheistic view. Many of them think they're going to come back as animals. So this notion somehow that we as a species today and as individuals are connected to animals is a logical outgrowth of our human prehistory and history. We've been deeply connected to animals and nature throughout all of the human experience. And animals have always been at the center of the human experience. And this notion of the bond is obviously something that the AZA is really core and central to who you are. But it has many different manifestations in our society. We have 171 million dogs and cats in our households. We spend more than $60 billion a year. If you add in the rabbits and the hamsters and the other animals, it gets beyond 350 million, which means there are more pets than people in American households. This is an incredible cultural circumstance for us to reflect on. But it's not just that. It's not just our pets, who are a window into the nature of individual creatures and the mysteries of individual creatures and nature. It's broader. Of course, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service just came out with its latest 5-year survey of hunting, fishing, and wildlife-associated recreation, and the numbers of wildlife watchers is spiking. It's 86 million active participants spending $76 billion. Of course, we have a whole set of federal lands. National Park Service units are just one, and we spend $36 billion just with national parks, and what an economic driver it is for gateway communities, for rural regions of the country to have these national parks. It's an economic development program because we are drawn to nature. This is part of who we are. And of course, one of the greatest expressions of this is the work that all of you do. I mean, what an extraordinary figure that Dan cited. 196 million people going through turnstiles at AZA accredited institutions, getting an opportunity to see remarkable creatures, to learn about conservation, to learn about proper care, to learn about the larger universe of species in the world. These are incredible markers in our culture of how we're connected to animals. But that's not the whole story, of course. We have a human society with a major footprint. This, of course, is a picture of Central Park. So in the height of human civilization, the biggest city in the United States, the city planners realized that we needed a park because we're so connected to nature, that people need to breathe this air, they need to see trees. So even in places where we build tall buildings, have roads, have enormous concentration of human settlement, we still are connected to nature. But obviously that comes with many, many impacts. And there are two sides to the human story with animals. We love animals, we're fascinated by them, we appreciate them, yet in the same culture where we have those values at work, we have species loss and animal cruelty on an almost unimaginable scale. And that's so much of what motivates our work at the Humane Society of the United States and our affiliates, and I know it's what motivates you in your work at your institutions and within the AZA. And I just want to give a little, I want to show you this graph as an historical marker on a core value of animal cruelty. So this is 1985, it's a map of the United States, of course, and there are three keys in the map. So in 1985, a state that had a blue pit bull type dog had a felony level penalty for dog fighting at that time. This is when I was in college, wasn't that long ago. I'm old, but not that old. And if you look at the white rooster, that's a state that had felony level penalties for cockfighting at that time, just a handful of states. And then it was just 4 states that had felony level penalties for the most malicious forms of cruelty, doing something truly awful to an individual animal. So basically we had a very, very modest patchwork of statutes, but very, very big gaps in the law. So we've been working to advance the notion that the most malicious forms of cruelty should not be tolerated in any way. And we've been working to see that that notion is enshrined in the law. And this is what the map looks like today. Every state now has felony level penalties for malicious cruelty. Every state has outlawed dog fighting and made it a felony. Every state has now outlawed cockfighting. And this is a marker for us. And I think one of the notions that we advance at the Humane Society is if we accept this notion that cruelty to animals is wrong, that it's codified in statute, that it's a universal value, how do we then logically apply anti-cruelty principles in a world where animals are widely used in many different sectors of the economy? Not used in ways where people are intentionally being malicious, but just kind of routines have developed and animals have been part of the equation. And in many ways, the intensification of the use of animals has become much more acute, leading to mass problems. So one of the things that we do is we attack some of the worst cruelties that exist to animals, as well as advance conservation imperatives in the US and beyond. Then, just as one marker, industrial agriculture is quite a user of animals. There are 9 billion animals raised for food every year in the United States. The average American consumes 30 animals a year. Yet we're deeply disconnected from so many of these agricultural enterprises. This is a ceiling level view of a modern industrial pig farm where the breeding sows are in a 2-foot by 7-foot cage. Now, the own evolution of zoos in our country has taught us and taught the American public about the importance of space, the importance of natural behaviors and natural movements. You have normalized the notion that animals should have some opportunities when they're in a captive setting to live their life like an animal. This notion then, when we show this sort of image to the public, or this image with laying hens jammed in wire cages, 6 or 8 birds in a cage, where the average hen has 67 square inches of paper. This is a 8.5 by 14 sheet of paper. If I were to make it an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, that's 93 square inches. So the hen has 2/3 of that, which is about this amount of living space for the entire 12 to 18 months that she's alive. Now, that's not acceptable, but that's been the norm in our society. And we are questioning this notion and advancing the notion to the biggest food sellers in the United States that their supply chains need to be changed and the practices need to be modified in order to reflect our sensibilities about animal cruelty and proper animal behavior and proper animal treatment. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we've gotten 300 of the biggest food retailers in the United States to change their purchasing practices. McDonald's is going completely cage-free. Walmart is doing the same. These companies are saying no to the gestation crate confinement. This is a marker in our society of the penetration of these values that you at AZA and that we at HSUS and other animal protection and conservation organizations have achieved. It's a triumph in so many ways. And of course, there are many other sectors where there are problems with animals. This is an image that ricocheted around the world in the era of social media. This American hunter traveled 8,000 or 9,000 miles away to shoot an African lion. He happened to have been one of the most studied lions in southern Africa. And once that image of these grinning people over this slain lion, who was lured out of Hwange National Park, baited with an elephant carcass, it appears, once that ricocheted around the world, people were horrified. And many people thought this is no way to treat the king of beasts. And this was really, a bit of assault on this ecosystem and on this national park. And within 4 to 6 weeks, all of these airlines said they are not going to transport the trophies, the heads and the other body parts of the Africa Big Five: lions, leopards, elephants, rhinos, and Cape buffalo. And again, we in this room may not all be united on the issue of trophy hunting, of carnivores or rare species. I think most of us are. But what an expression of public disapproval for this, that so many of the biggest airlines in the world, carrying tens of millions of passengers, said, listen, now that people know what's in the cargo hold, we're not going to stick with this plan. And of course, Botswana, as many of you know, just a couple of years ago, it banned all trophy hunting of elephants and lions, and now markets itself as kind of an exemplar of the humane economy from a country perspective, and markets itself as a destination for eco-tourists. Animal testing is another example. Many of you have heard about the mistreatment of animals in laboratories for cosmetic testing. Now, all of these companies now market their products saying, we don't do animal testing. So you can see, when you look across different sectors of the economy, there's been this elevation in animal welfare. There's been this penetration of these ideas into corporate behavior as well as public policy. That is the sort of environment and atmospheric that you help to create, and also that is going to ask more and more of us as these attitudes of Americans and people throughout the world continue to evolve. And of course, part of that evolution has to do with captive wildlife. And I think many people were upset at some of the images that animal protection groups obtained of wild animals and traveling circus acts, some of the training techniques, the long distance transport, the captivity, the isolation of the animals. And of course, after 146 years, it was quite an incredible moment when Ringling Brothers shuttered its operation in May because of changing tastes. Again, so much of it a very sharp contrast between what AZA accredited institutions do in terms of animal care and proper treatment of captive animals versus what many of these traveling circuses do. So, I recently watched Jim in the zoo, the 8-part series about the Wildlife Conservation Society and one of its institutions, the Bronx Zoo. And I was really, captivated by Jim's thoughts about AZA institutions and how zoos must have a higher mission and a higher purpose. The goal is not just to exhibit animals, it's to contribute beyond the borders and the boundaries of the physical zoo, and to have an impact in the larger universe in this time of crisis. And I think that this is so aligned with who we are at the Humane Society. It's what you do. So the whole notion that somehow we are apart on these issues, to me, this was just an affirmation of what we've been doing. It's an affirmation of what you've been doing. And of course, there's been change within the zoological profession. When I was a kid, one of my greatest thrills was going to the Bronx Zoo, but we also went to some of the other zoos. I'm from New Haven, Connecticut, and it was a disappointing experience for me when I was a kid. And when I went to the Central Park Zoo and I saw, the former Central Park Zoo, when I saw jaguars and leopards and lions pacing in a small cage going back and forth, I ruined the trip for my parents and my schoolmates whenever we did it. I had the notion just instinctively without knowing anything in the literature that the Bronx Zoo experience was a really good one, and this other experience was a really bad one. And what an evolution, because of so many of you, there's been within your profession within my adult lifetime. And to see the facilities, my friend Ron Kagan has showed me around his facility, and I've been to so many of your facilities through the years, and just constant improvement, constant attempts to perfect, to do better on animal welfare, to give a better experience for the customers and the clients. So this is part of your profession, and this is something to celebrate, the fact that we can look back as a benchmark on how the animals were held and what the standards were, and now to have AZA's top flight gold standard for accreditation is so important. And there are other groups that are seem to be jockeying in this space. There's a similarly named group, the Zoological Association of America, that doesn't have standards that get even close to where you are. And there's an animal welfare group that says it's going to do accreditation standards where its animal welfare standards don't approximate yours. I mean, if this happens and these groups gain momentum with lesser standards, it's going to drive everything down. I mean, the AZA standard needs to be the animal welfare standard. It needs to be the public safety standard. It needs to be the conservation standard. This is the gold standard. And when I talk about this is not just with AZA. We're doing this in other areas. We now, and I'm on the board of the Global Animal Partnership that is going to farms and working with farmers to improve the treatment of animals on the farms. And now we have thousands of farms in the United States that are part of GAP. If you go to Whole Foods and now you go to other stores, you'll see step-rated programs. This is a multi-tiered rating system where there's a minimum standard at 1, but it's still a strong animal welfare standard, and then progressively higher standards, 6 different levels, where consumers then have choice, where they can opt in for these products and know that there's a third-party validated standard for these products. As I mentioned, these hoarding cases before, there are people who say that we're a sanctuary, we're an animal protection group, and the treatment of the animals in these facilities is terrible. So that's why we've been a part of creating the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries to have accredited standards for animal sanctuaries. And we're not nearly as well developed as AZA, but we're on the path and we're guided by what AZA has done to build these strong standards. And in the broader sense, I want to mention some of the things where we really see union with the AZA accredited institutions, where we see this is where things should be going. We had a partnership with SeaWorld that was announced last year on some reforms that it instituted after many months of private discussions. And, I went to SeaWorld, I went to the Orlando facility and saw the manatee protection efforts, and the back of the room, or the back of the building, wildlife rehabilitation efforts, seeing the manatees. I've been thinking about the manatees, of course, with the terrible events in Florida over the past 24 hours. And I had called Joel Manby and said, hey, maybe, whatever we can do to help. We know you've got great facilities, but this is a great service to our society. It's a great service to animals, and it needs to be part of the story. It's part of the narrative on how accredited zoos and aquariums contribute to animal welfare and to conservation and to animal protection. And of course, Ron Kagan has been doing this, and Ron Foreman, and so many of you have been leaders on this animal welfare issue for so many years, taking a bear from a terrible circumstance, putting the animal into a new, much better environment, and then telling the story so that people, the millions of people who go to AZA accredited institutions, now have a much richer, deeper, variegated understanding of what's happening with animals. Of course, Carl mentioned the saving species, these notions of, the California condor. Maybe there was some controversy about that at the time, taking the condors in. I don't think there's nearly as much controversy now that condors have been restored to some degree, and condors have been a focus of conservation with the lead ammunition ban in California is going to help dozens and dozens of species that are adversely affected by lead left behind by sport hunting. Obviously, the vaquita, who knows how that's going to turn out, but the instinct is right to say, hey, we're going to throw ourselves into this fight and try to do something. Maybe it's not going to work, but we're going to do the best that we can. Meanwhile, working on systems protection so that animals don't get into that circumstance. We worked with the Lincoln Park Zoo in protecting captive chimpanzees, and Dan, as director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, uplisted the protections for chimpanzees. This was also, I think, a great example of another species that's been benefited by our collaboration. This issue of roadside zoos and menageries, this is dragging down the profession. People touch these places and they see it and they don't understand, and then they see a similarly named group that embraces these issues, the AZA and then the ZAA. The nomenclature is just really, really similar and is confusing, and people don't get it. I think AZA, and I know that it's being done by so many of you because I work with you, needs to speak out forthrightly against institutions that don't meet any standard, that are irresponsible when it comes to the treatment of animals, the breeding of animals, the disposition of the animals once they no longer want them or need them. This is a big issue, and there's no group that speaks more powerfully, more credibly, with more science than AZA on this issue. We can do it, and we're happy to do it in the sense that we feel a duty to do it, but we don't have nearly the credibility that you do, but we do want to partner with you on that. And for many years, AZA has advocated alongside us with for policies to stop private citizens from keeping dangerous wild animals as pets. A tiger in the backyard or the basement. This is a calamity in terms of animal welfare, and I will tell you that there's a terrible impact on the animal welfare community because we take so many of these cast-offs, 150 big cat sanctuaries that spend tens of millions of dollars cleaning up someone else's problem. This is another case where we need to prevent. The Big Cat Public Safety Act, a federal bill, is part of the response to deal with that at the federal level. Dan mentioned the shark finning issue. We're so pleased to be collaborating with you. Let's get this bill done. Let's get the Congress to act on this and stop this destruction of tens of millions of sharks throughout the world for a little part of their body. It's just like the ivory issue, which is, again, another great example of the leadership that AZA, whether it was the Wildlife Conservation Society or so many of you, Don Moore in Portland, we were working on a ballot measure on that issue. Washington State worked with the organizations in the AZA accredited institutions on a ballot measure there, and also, of course, on the federal level. We must advocate for species protection at the federal level. And, I want to conclude. This is a picture of George Patton with his dog, but he didn't say this exactly, but he was credited with it. But it was George Bernard Shaw who made the observation that Great Britain and the United States were two countries divided by a common language. So what does that mean? We're speaking the same language, but we end up in different places, and sometimes we don't understand each other. And I think of zoos and animal protection groups as two communities divided by a common concern. For too long, we've tried to separate ourselves. We've tried to say, well, we're different. We have different purposes. We have different missions. We're different people. We're different places. We're different institutions. The goal that we all should have in fighting this sixth extinction, fighting this mass cruelty to animals, is the same. We're all part of the same enterprise. We're part of the same cause. We're not always going to agree with each other on everything. We don't agree internally at the Humane Society of the United States on everything. We have robust debates on policies. There are schisms within the animal welfare movement proper over issues. To expect complete fidelity on all of the issues is just not our human experience. But look at all of these things in common, and look at how together our respective causes have really gained so much momentum in our society. And now our institutions, our ideas, are forces for the good in our society. So I really am grateful to be here today. I'm honored to speak at an AZA National Convention. I thank the board. I thank all of you for the work that you do every day to make animals' lives better. Thanks very much.